This is my most prized recipe of all. It's my king cake. By far the most tested recipe of mine from other people, and I always have had good reports. I've made 2 videos about it in the past 2 years, and this is just gonna be this year's edition. I haven't changed the recipe because I haven't found any way to make it better yet. I just wanted to make an updated video, and this one I'm just gonna narrate throughout the process as opposed to doing it in post. If you haven't tried this one before, I hope you do. Enjoy. The first order of business is to make this Tangzhong paste. It's a Japanese baking technique that's gonna keep our dough soft and moist for longer. So let's make it. I like to do this in a wide, shallow pan as opposed to like a tall sauce pot because more surface area, it's faster. So I get that going over medium heat, starting with 60 grams of bread flour, also a half cup or 120 mils of water, and then 3/4 of a cup or 180 mils of whole milk. Use a spatula to incorporate everything. Try to break up any lumps of flour that you see. Over the course of, I don't know, 5 to 7 minutes, this will thicken up and become that Tangzhong paste that we want. Actually, a whisk will be a little better to break up some of these lumps. And you can already see this thickening up pretty quickly. Just make sure you're continuously stirring so nothing is sticking to the bottom and burning. And there you go, not even 5 minutes, and this is the paste that you're looking for. Perfect. I'm just gonna set that aside to cool while we get the other stuff ready. All right, also I've got 120 mils or a half cup of whole milk that we're gonna proof some yeast in. I've heated this to 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the microwave just so it's a warm environment for the yeast to proof in. Satisfying. If you're just using the packets, which are 7 grams each, then 1 packet's gonna do. But if you have the jar like this, then I like to do a little bit more just because I like the yeast flavor. I'm going with 9 grams. Also, this is 100 grams or a half cup of sugar that I'm already gonna be using in the dough, so I'm gonna steal a little bit of that just to help the yeast feed on something. Just mix that up, and then we're gonna let this sit for 5 minutes to proof the yeast. All right, once you've got this,
frothy boy,
you know your yeast is proofed and you're ready to go. You've proven that your yeast is alive. Is that what that means? I have no idea. All right, the only way to make this dough is with a stand mixer. I say that because this dough is full of fat. It's enriched, which makes it really hard to knead, especially by hand. And it's a high volume of dough, so it just makes it even harder. I'd say invest in one of these if you're gonna be doing any amount of dough making or anything like that more than once. So I'm starting with 600 grams or about 5 cups of bread flour. I almost always add more midway through the mixing, but this is what I start with. Then I've got 10 grams or 1.5 teaspoons of kosher salt. The rest of that 100 grams or half cup of sugar. Just pretend I didn't forget to grate in some fresh nutmeg here. I'm just gonna lightly incorporate that by hand just so it's sort of even. Then I'm gonna add in this frothy boy, get all that yeast in there, and this Tangzhong paste. All right, I'm gonna get that going over low to medium low, just so the dry stuff kind of gets incorporated first. All right, after a couple minutes, it sort of comes together, but it's pretty dry because we're missing the eggs and the butter, which I have 2 eggs plus 2 egg yolks that I'm gonna incorporate 1 yolk at a time. That'll start to loosen up the dough. Okay, and the last component we need to add is 1 stick or 8 tablespoons or 113 grams of very softened butter. I always use Kerrygold for my king cakes. 1, because 1 block or 2 sticks is the perfect amount for the whole king cake. But 2, just because European butter is superior and there's so much butter in this recipe that it really makes a difference if you use higher quality stuff. So with this going on low, I'm just gonna zip in about 1 tablespoon at a time just so I can incorporate. All right, once all the butter is incorporated, I'm just gonna let this go over high heat, but I'm gonna come back in about 5 minutes to evaluate the potential need for more flour, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Don't walk away from this for too long. All right, it's been about 5 minutes, and here's what my dough looks like right now. So it's actually not too bad. It's a little wetter than it needs to be, so it does need some more flour. You can tell by the bottom, and it's not fully pulling away from the sides when it mixes. King cake dough and cinnamon roll dough is really wet, so it's never gonna be like fully cohesive, but at least while it's mixing, you wanna see it sort of pull together as the hook is pulling it. So I usually only need like 1/4 to 1/3, sometimes a half cup of flour at this point. I don't really measure, you just kind of go by feel. You just don't wanna add too much flour because once this dries out too much, it's no longer appetizing. So we're gonna finish mixing and see how we're doing at that point. All right, and after 8 minutes, our mixing is done. For a final texture, you're looking for something that you can touch and it feels sticky, but it's not actually gonna stick to your hands. That's the ideal dough. You can definitely tell when it's too dry and also when it's too wet if it just completely stays on your hands when you touch it. You can tell if there's enough mixing done, if you can pull this and stretch it without it tearing. That's the window pane test. Perfect. All right, now I'm just gonna get one of the biggest bowls that I have and then spray it with some cooking spray. I'm just gonna transfer the dough into here to let it rise completely. And for this type of dough and this size of dough, I always let it go for 2 hours or more I know a lot of recipes just call for 1 hour rise times, but in my experience, it's just way better to let it go longer. It relaxes more and rises more, and it just ends up in a fluffier, better final product. Just gonna cover it in some plastic wrap and then stick it in a warm place. For me, it's winter time right now, so my house is very cold. So what I'm gonna do is turn my oven on to its lowest setting for 2 to 3 minutes and then turn it off, and that'll be my proofing setting. I'll be back in 2 hours. This dude went off. This is exactly the puffage that we wanted. I'm gonna get some flour down to prevent sticking. By the way, this is the most fun part here. Sick. Also gonna get a little flour on top, and we're just gonna carefully roll this out pretty thin into a rectangle. I don't think dimensions are super important as long as you get this fairly thin and really make sure it's even all around. And what gets pretty tricky is these outer corners that will end up with less mass than the middle, and you'll have uneven strips. So what I try to do is pull these corners out as sharp as I can to make them, less rounded. Just make sure this middle is pressed as flat as I can. I mean, it's almost never perfect, but you just try to get as close as you can for the best final product. All right, this next part is easiest done with a pizza cutter. And what I'm gonna do is cut 3 as even strips as I can. I try to score this on either side so I have sort of a straight line to go across, and just to make sure it looks even before I actually cut it. All right, and then just cut confidently, but carefully. Just make sure it's not sticking underneath, and I'm separating the strips. All right, to begin the filling process, I'm starting with 4 tablespoons or 57 grams of very soft butter. I say on the brink of melting because it makes it easier to spread this across the dough without tearing it. An offset spatula or a spoon would be easiest to do this. I wouldn't do it with a knife. You don't need 100% coverage with this because we're gonna be coming behind it with some heavy cream. Like I said, I've got 2 tablespoons or so of heavy cream that I'm gonna brush and to fill in the gaps over the butter. And then for the filling, I have about 160 grams or 2/3 of a cup of light brown sugar. I'm gonna add a tablespoon or 8 grams of cinnamon, just a small pinch of salt, and just quickly combine those. We'll just evenly sprinkle that over each of the strips. And I just come through and brush this around to make it flat and even into all the dough. If you notice, I'm leaving a little margin around the edges of each of the strips just to help them seal when I roll them up. All right, and just like cinnamon rolls, we're gonna roll these up. Pretty self-explanatory. Just try to keep it as tight as possible. All right, just keep the seam on the bottom and then repeat with the rest of the strips. All right, so now we've got 3 strips. You can see that they're not fully even. As usual, the middle piece is the thickest one, so that's not the end of the world. What I just do here is I stretch out each of the strips kind of as long as the thinnest strip will let me, which I think is going to be this strip up top. Try to make that as even as you can. Be careful not to tear it. It's just going to make for a less bulky cake because it's going to rise once again after we build it, and then it's of course going to rise in the oven. So we're trying to be as conservative as we can until that time. And then all I'm doing here is just stretching the other 2 to be about the same length as that one. Good there. All right, that's good enough. All right, and now comes the braiding process, which is not as intimidating as it sounds, I promise. As long as you do it slowly and follow step by step, it's really easy. All right, on one of the ends, you're just gonna put all the 3 strips together. You don't have to smush them or anything, just make sure they're together. All right, so you've got your middle strip, which is gonna make the first move, and you can choose either side. I'm gonna go over this right outer strip. You're gonna cover it like that. Now you have a new middle strip, which was on the outside, and then that one's gonna make the next move, which is gonna go over the left. You're just gonna alternate like that. And I come to this end here and I just pull it tight so that the braid stays intact. And then the new middle goes back over the right and so on. This braiding, in my opinion, is what gives this king cake a superior texture. Just makes it more interesting than just a single roll like a cinnamon roll. Okay, and now we're braided. We're just gonna wrap this around itself to make an oval. Again, I'm gonna stretch this a little bit as I go because we're trying to keep this thin until it finally puffs up at the end. All right, I've made dozens of these king cakes and I still struggle with putting this end together. I just kind of wrap these pieces around it, kind of like if I was continuing the braid, and then just press them a little bit together, and they usually are fine. All right, and you need a big baking sheet for this. This is not the standard size. I think this is like 15 by 21 or something. It is linked below. And then I carefully just load the cake onto the sheet. We're gonna reform it so it's okay if it comes apart. All right, that's good enough. All we need to do is cover this with a towel and then let this rise one more time for, I'd say, almost an hour. 45 minutes is probably good. All right, we've reached our final form. My oven has been preheated to 350 Fahrenheit or 180 Celsius. And just before baking, I have 1 egg beaten with a little bit of milk for an egg wash. I'm gonna apply that to the outside. Just get it all over. This is gonna help the outside brown and give it a beautiful brioche exterior. All right, we're ready to bake. This usually bakes anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes. We're gonna come back around 20 minutes and check. All right, this is us at 20 minutes. The cake has puffed up significantly. Got some nice browning on the outside. I'm just looking for a little bit more browning, especially where this dough is separating, so I'm gonna give it a few more minutes. All right, this is 25 minutes. We've got deeper browning all around, and I'm gonna pull it out now just because this higher side here is gonna start burning if I don't. This is pretty spot on, perfect for what you want. Now, immediately after pulling this out of the oven, we're gonna act fast. I have 2 more tablespoons of heavy cream. I'm gonna brush that all around the exterior of the cake. This is a common technique for many baked goods, that you just brush cream around the edge. That's gonna soften up that exterior so it's not too dry and crunchy. And then cream is basically just fat, so it's gonna soak into the cake and add a lot more flavor. Do not skip this step. Okay, we're just gonna let this sit here for about 5 minutes before we transfer it to a baking rack and let it cool completely. And while it cools, we can make this amazing icing. This starts with 320 grams or 2.5 cups of powdered sugar that we're gonna sift. This just ensures no sugar pockets and so that everything can mix homogeneously. It's a little annoying and it makes a little bit of a mess, but I think this step is definitely worth it. Then we'll add 56 grams or that last half stick of butter, melted. Then I add 20-ish grams or 1.5 tablespoons of corn syrup. Really helps with the shine of the glaze. A splash of good vanilla extract. Since we're not cooking this glaze, the vanilla that you use matters. I always use the imitation stuff if I'm cooking it, but the taste comes out in the good stuff if you're not cooking it. The secret ingredient in my king cake icing is lemon juice. It just balances all the sweetness perfectly, but you only need a little bit. 1 teaspoon or 4 grams is all you need. Pinch of salt because it tastes better. Then you just need to add a conservative amount of whole milk just to get to the right consistency. Start with a little bit. In my opinion, thicker is far better for king cake icing, so be extremely careful with the amount of liquid that you add because a little bit makes a huge difference, but I do need a little more. So this is too thick for me, but not far off from what I want, so I'm just gonna add a little bit more. All right, and this is just about perfect for me. Take a look. Thick consistency, but it has a little bit of flow to it. I'd say enough to hold itself on the whisk, but the weight of it starts to pull it off and it doesn't take much shaking to actually get the frosting off. I just don't want it to be streaming off the whisk like a waterfall. So we set this aside until the king cake is cool.
A few minutes later.
Let's ice this guy. I'm gonna give it a few little dollops all around and then I'll spread them to connect. All right, just try to get some even coverage. That's just a piece of art if I've ever seen one. So pretty traditional here is to use this sanding sugar and get different colors all over the cake, but I can't stand their texture, so I just use these Mardi Gras colored sprinkles. I haven't found these locally, but anybody can buy them on Amazon. I'll link them below. Before the icing sets, just make sure you get a good layer all around. All right, all that's left to do is let the icing set for another 15 minutes and then we can dig in. All right, time's up, let's get in there. Just marvel at that cross section. Perfection. It's literally like 3 little cinnamon rolls stacked together. That's why the braid is superior. I feel like I'm being awarded something. I love when this time of year comes around, not because I'm a fan of Mardi Gras, but this always happens at the beginning of the year, so it's a new start, and this is just some of my favorite part of New Orleans cuisine. And of course, in the last 2 years, I've become a huge fan of king cake just because of how much I've played with them at home and how good it's been to me in the videos and in just everything. So I've taste tested this many times, but cheers. Life-changingly good. Man, it still hits just as good as the very first time. I'm just amazed at how well this dough comes out every time, super soft and moist. All the flavors that you want, everything is just perfect. If you're one of the number of people that have tried this recipe and let me know, I really, really appreciate it. And if this cake has ministered to you in any way, then I'm just really happy to hear that. The icing just complements the inside of the cake so well. This makes me want to start a king cake store every year, but I'm not gonna do that. I have nothing else to say, but I appreciate all of you and your support. If you celebrate Mardi Gras, then I hope you enjoy that. And if you've never been to New Orleans, then get down here and try some of this food. Thank you all for watching, be blessed, and I'll see you next year. I'm not saying it's perfect, but there's just no way I can improve that recipe.